Thomas Mercer had seen what cold could do to a human body. He had pulled frozen men from barn floors and carried stiff children out of farmhouses where the iron stove had surrendered sometime in the first night, and the family had not survived to tend it again. He was 44 years old, and he had lived in Dakota Territory for 11 winters. And he believed in the way that a man believes things that have been confirmed by repeated and painful experience, that he knew every face that death wore in this particular country. He did not know this face. The morning of January 15th, 1888, was the third morning after the storm that would eventually be called the school children's blizzard, and Mercer led 6 men on horseback through a landscape that no longer resembled anything he had grown up understanding as land. The drifts had buried fence lines and outbuildings, and in some places rose higher than a man sitting on horseback. The sky was the particular pale gray of extreme cold, the kind of sky that offered no warmth and no promise of warmth, a sky that simply pressed down on everything beneath it, with the indifferent weight of a season that was not finished. They had visited 4 homesteads already that morning. At the first, a family alive but barely the father's right hand wrapped in cloth over fingers that would not survive the week. The children swaddled in curtains because every blanket in the house had been stuffed into the gaps in the walls where the wind had found its way through. At the second, a Norwegian woman on her kitchen floor with her youngest child still in her arms. The iron stove in the corner stood cold as a gravestone. Whatever fire it had held was gone spent against a cold that had no intention of being spent in return. At the third homestead, a family had burned their furniture. At the fourth, sections of their own floor. Now, Mercer rode toward the tar paper shack at the edge of a claim that sat at the western boundary of Freeman, and he was not hopeful. Everyone in town knew something about the people who had taken up that claim in August. A woman in her 60s. People said a widow from somewhere in the East German, they thought, or Russian, or some combination of the two, that the prairie did not have a precise category for. She had arrived with a young man who might have been her grandson, and a brown dog and very little else that anyone could see. The land agent had written his assessment in the official record within a week of their arrival. Survival prospects, none. That had been 5 months ago. Mercer pulled his horse up at the edge of the claim and looked at the structure. It was small, 12 feet by 14 at the most, with walls of tar paper stretched over rough lumber. The drifts had piled up around its base, until it appeared the earth itself was attempting to swallow it whole. The chimney was visible above the roof line. There was no smoke coming from it. In 40 below weather, no smoke from a chimney meant one of 2 things, and both things amounted to the same conclusion. Mercer dismounted. The snow came past his knees. One of the men behind him began quietly the first words of a prayer. Mercer reached the door. He knocked with his fist, and the door shuddered in its frame but did not open. The drift packed against it had frozen solid. He and 2 others dug with their hands, and the short-handled spade one of them had thought to bring, and after several minutes they had cleared enough to pull the door outward. Warm air came out, not a little warmth, not the faint residual memory of a fire that had died an hour ago. Warm air, genuine and steady and absolutely present, the kind of warmth that came from a room where the temperature had been maintained through something ongoing, something working against the cold. Not in a single desperate expenditure, but continuously hour after hour through 3 days of temperatures that had killed more than 200 people across the Great Plains. It came out against Mercer's face like a wave, and he stood in the doorway with his mouth open, and did not for a moment understand what he was experiencing. Inside the shack, a woman was kneading bread dough at a small table. She turned when she heard the door. She was older, 60 or more, with white hair pulled back from a face that had the particular quality of someone who had been expecting visitors eventually, but had not known exactly when. She looked at Mercer and the men behind him with an expression that contained neither surprise nor fear, only a kind of steady acknowledgement that they had arrived, and that she had things to attend to, and that the two facts were not incompatible. Behind her, near the far wall, a young man sat reading. He looked up when the cold air came in and then looked back at his book with the particular calm of someone who had spent the past 3 days in a warm room and was not yet ready to be reminded that the world outside it existed. On the floor beside the most unusual object Mercer had ever seen inside a residence, a brown dog lay sleeping. Its tail moved once when the draft reached it, but it did not get up. It was warm where it was, and it had decided, with the wisdom of animals that have found warmth in dangerous cold, that there was no reason to move. And throughout the room, on the warm floor and leaning against the warm walls, 7 other people sat or rested. Mercer recognized faces. The Whitmore family. Old Ingmar Dow from the Norwegian settlement 2 miles east. Father Cormac, the Irish priest who served the small Catholic community in the county. The Callahan women from the homestead on the North Road. 9 people. 9 people alive and warm in a tar paper shack that was 12 feet wide and 14 feet long in the middle of the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the American Great Plains. Mercer stepped inside. He was a man who had spent his adult life in circumstances that required him to be difficult to astonish, and he was thoroughly astonished. In the center of the room stood an object that he had no framework for understanding. It was massive, nearly chest height, roughly 6 feet square, built from what appeared to be handmade clay bricks, whitewashed on the outside until they gleamed in the gray light from the single greased paper window. It radiated heat the way a stone wall in summer held, and released the warmth it had absorbed from the sun steadily, evenly, without any visible effort or any visible source. He walked toward it and placed his palm flat against its surface. Warm. Not hot in the way an iron stove was hot. Not the sharp, radiating heat of metal that had recently held fire. But warm in the way that living things were warm, constant and reliable and present. He crouched down and pressed his hand against the earth floor beside its base. The floor was warm, too. He could feel it through his palm. Heat rising from the packed dirt itself, as though in this one small room the ground had decided to take the side of the people living on it. The tall Swede named Erickson, who had been farming in Turner County for 8 years, and who had not in all that time been known to display strong emotion about anything, walked past Mercer and stood in front of the clay structure and took his hat off. He held it against his chest with both hands, the way a man held his hat in a church. Mercer turned to the woman. She told him they had used about 1/3 of a bundle of twisted grass in 3 days. He looked at the bundle she pointed to in the corner. He looked at the stove. He looked at the bundle again. Then he took out his notebook and began writing, and he wrote for a long time without looking up. To understand what he was writing about, you have to go back 5 months. You have to go back to August of 1887, to the heat and the dust, and a wagon that creaked in ways that suggested it might not survive another week, moving west across the Dakota Prairie toward a town called Freeman. Marta Brandt was 62 years old when she arrived in Turner County. She had been born in a German colony on the Ukrainian steppe, in a community of families who had come to Russia under Catherine the Great 2 generations before, and had stayed because the land was good and the winters were survivable if you understood what you were doing. She had grown up speaking German at the table and Russian in the fields, and a mixture of both everywhere else in the way of people whose identity was defined less by a single country than by a specific set of skills for living in difficult places. She had been married for 31 years to a man named Friedrich Brandt, who had died of a chest illness 3 winters ago. She had been a mother to 1 son, whose name she did not often speak aloud. because speaking it still cost her something she could not always afford to spend. The son had died the previous spring, leaving behind a wife who did not survive the summer, and a boy of 17 who had nowhere else to go. The boy was Ansel. He was 18 now, tall and quiet with his grandfather's build and his grandmother's eyes. He had come to her in the spring with nothing but what he was carrying, and she had looked at him for a long time and seen everything she had loved and lost, standing in front of her in a form that still had most of its life ahead of it. They had sold what could be sold and packed what could be carried and pointed west. The brown dog, whose name was Copper for the color of his coat in certain light, had found them on the road out of Nebraska, thin and abandoned and following at a distance that suggested he had been disappointed by people before and was not yet certain whether to risk another attempt. Ansel had left food at the edge of the camp 3 nights running, and on the 4th morning Copper was still there, and by the time they crossed into Dakota territory, he was riding in the wagon. At the bottom of the canvas bag, wedged under the wagon seat, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had protected it across 2 continents and more years than Marta could precisely count, was the object she considered the most valuable thing she owned. It was a small notebook. The leather cover was cracked and soft from decades of handling. The pages were yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting inside was clear and precise. The careful, measured script of a woman who understood that what she was writing might someday need to be read under difficult circumstances, and had planned accordingly. The woman who had written it was named Liesel. She had been Marta's great-grandmother, and she had survived 72 winters on the Ukrainian steppe, and she had wanted to make certain that the women who came after her could survive them too. What Liesel had written down in German across 47 pages of a leather notebook that had traveled from Ukraine to the American frontier in the bottom of a canvas bag were the dimensions, the specifications, the proportions, and the principles of a masonry stove. Not the iron stoves that stood in the corner of every homestead on the Dakota prairie, compact and portable and manufactured somewhere distant by people who presumably knew what they were doing. Liesel had written about something older and heavier and more permanent, something that the German colonists on the Russian steppe had long ago adopted from their Ukrainian neighbors after discovering that the heating traditions of their European homeland were not equal to the demands of a Russian winter. A masonry stove operated on a principle that most people in Turner County in 1887 had never had occasion to consider, because the principle was not obvious, and the stove itself was not convenient, and the American frontier had developed a general preference for things that were convenient. An iron stove heated quickly and cooled quickly. Most of the heat it generated went straight up the chimney, out of the room into the air above the prairie. Its efficiency was low and its demands were constant. It needed fuel and attention, and more attention. And on the 3rd day of a blizzard, when the woodpile was buried under 6 feet of compacted snow, it went cold. A masonry stove built from hundreds of clay bricks with a labyrinthine network of channels inside that slowed the passage of hot air on its way to the chimney worked in precisely the opposite direction. You fired it hot and fast for 20 minutes, burning almost anything that would catch. The heat from those 20 minutes traveled through the channels, heating hundreds of pounds of dense clay as it passed. The fire went out. The clay did not cool for 20 hours. It radiated that stored heat slowly and evenly into the room, warming the floor through conduction, warming the walls, warming the air, at the height where people actually lived and breathed. Marta had helped her own grandmother build one when she was 11 years old, mixing clay and straw in the yard. On a summer morning, her grandmother's hands guiding hers to feel for the right consistency in the mixture. The knowledge passing through touch rather than through instruction, living in the hands before it lived in the head. This is how our people outsmart the cold. Liesel's daughter had told her, pressing her palm to the warm surface of a finished stove, not by having more than the cold, by being smarter than it. Marta had built her first stove alone at the age of 22. She had built her last one in Ukraine 4 years ago. In the 40 years between those two, she had built more than she had counted. She was not going to Dakota to learn how to survive. She was going to Dakota because Ansel needed a future, and the land was available, and she was 62 years old, and there was nothing left for her in the places she had already been. They arrived in Freeman in the first week of August. The heat was extraordinary, the kind of flat, relentless heat that the prairie generated without apology in the months before it turned and generated flat, relentless cold with equal indifference. The claim they had registered by letter from Nebraska was on the western edge of the county, 160 acres of grass and sky, with a structure on it that had been abandoned after one winter by the previous homesteader. The structure was 12 feet wide and 14 feet long, with walls of tar paper stretched over rough lumber. Daylight came through the walls in several places. A cracked iron stove sat in one corner with the expression, "If iron could have an expression of something that had been angry for a long time." The floor was packed dirt. The single window was covered with greased paper in place of glass. On the third day after their arrival, a man came on horseback. Edgar Voss was 50 years old, and he wore a coat that had never been dirty, and he moved through the world with the particular assurance of a man who had never been required to think very hard about his own survival, because other people had always managed the difficult parts for him. He was the land agent for Turner County, which meant that he held a specific kind of power over the people who came to Dakota looking for something to put their futures into. And he had learned over the years that this power was worth considerably more than his official salary if he was willing to use it with discretion. What Marta did not know, and what she would not learn in its entirety until much later, was that a rancher from Sioux Falls had already sent Voss a letter 3 months before her arrival, expressing interest in this particular claim, and enclosing something that expressed that interest in more concrete terms. The rancher had made it clear that 2 elderly women traveling with a young man were the kind of obstacle he expected the land office to help resolve, quietly and officially, through the ordinary machinery of bureaucratic assessment. Voss walked around the shack once. He looked at the cracked stove. He looked at the 2 people standing in the yard with a brown dog between them. He wrote something in his leather notebook. "Survival prospects," he said, not looking at either of them. "None. I will recommend this claim be reassigned by spring." Ansel said nothing. He had already learned at 18 that certain men had decided on their conclusions before they arrived, and that words addressed to such men were a form of waste. Marta stepped forward. Her English was careful, each word placed with the precision of someone who had learned a language as an adult and treated it with the respect of something earned rather than inherited. She told him they would be there in the spring. She told him they would be there in every spring after that. She told him this land belonged to them. Voss looked at her with the patient, tolerant expression that men like him directed at people who did not yet understand how things worked. He said they would see. He rode away. Marta watched him go. Then she went to the canvas bag under the wagon seat and took out the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it with hands that were steady. And she opened the notebook to the first page. And she began to read in the way you read something you already know, but need to hold in your hands anyway to remind yourself of what you are carrying. That same week, a neighbor came. Clarence Whitmore was 52 years old, broad and gray, a man built on the same general principle as the Dakota landscape itself, large and unhurried and quietly formidable. He had farmed in Turner County for 16 years, and had survived things and had also lost things, which was a different kind of experience, and often a more instructive one. In the winter of 1881, his daughter Nell had died when their iron stove failed during a 3-day storm. She was 7 years old. Whitmore had not spoken of her publicly since her funeral, but he thought about her whenever he looked at a child standing near a stove, which in a Dakota winter meant he thought about her often. He came on horseback on the 5th day, ostensibly to introduce himself. Actually, because the sight of a woman in her 60s and a young man trying to establish a homestead before winter was something he found impossible to ride past without stopping. He looked at the shack. He looked at the cracked stove through the open door. He told them they could not winter there. Not with that stove. Not with those walls. He gave them the number of cords of wood required for a minimum adequate winter in Turner County. He gave them the cost per cord. He added the cost of coal and the cost of hauling, and then he stood there and let the arithmetic do what arithmetic did. Marta listened to all of it. He had expected fear, or the tight-lipped, controlled fear that presented itself as determination. What he saw instead was calculation. She was doing something behind her eyes, measuring something, and whatever she was measuring, it was not the distance between herself and failure. She told him she had seen winter beaten before, not with wood, not with coal. He waited. She said with clay. He did not understand this, and she did not have enough English to explain the physics in a way that would have meant anything to a man who had never stood in a room with a masonry stove on a January morning and felt the floor warm beneath his feet. The conversation ended with Whitmore riding home uncertain about what he had just witnessed, and Marta walking back into the shack to prepare for what came next. That night, after Ansel had fallen asleep and Copper had curled at the foot of his blankets, Marta sat on the dirt floor with the notebook open on her knees and read by the light of a small lamp. She did not need to read it. She had read it so many times over so many years that she knew it the way she knew her own hands. But she read it anyway, the way you return to a letter from someone you loved, not for the information, but for the voice. Liesel had written in the voice of someone who had taught things before and knew how teaching worked. She described proportions rather than measurements, explaining what the mixture should feel like in the hands when it was right, how the channels should be laid to slow the heat without trapping it, how the whitewashing should be applied to seal the surface and allow the heat to radiate evenly, rather than escaping at weak points. She wrote with the specificity of someone who had made every possible mistake and had incorporated those mistakes into the instructions as warnings to whoever came after. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in smaller writing that had the quality of a personal aside rather than a technical instruction, Liesel had written a single sentence that Marta had been reading for 40 years without fully understanding, and that she was beginning in a tar paper shack on the Dakota prairie with winter 3 months away to understand for the first time. The knowledge is not yours to keep. It is yours to give. The work began the next morning. Ansel did not understand what his grandmother was proposing. He was a practical young man who believed in things he could verify, and clay stoves existed only in a notebook and in his grandmother's memory, and in a place he had never been. Iron stoves existed in every house he had ever lived in. Iron stoves had been made somewhere by people with machinery and expertise. But he had no better idea, and his grandmother had a look in her eyes that he had learned in the months they had been traveling together to recognize as the end of negotiation. So he dug. He dug clay from the creek bank 1/2 mile from the shack 2 hours every morning and 2 hours every evening, carrying it back in buckets that grew heavier with every trip as the clay absorbed water from the creek bed. Marta mixed it with cut prairie grass and dried material from the field behind the shack, ingredients that would have seemed improbable to anyone watching, but that created in the right proportions a brick material with the specific density and thermal mass that Liesel's notebook required. She built wooden molds from scrap lumber and began casting bricks, laying them out in rows to dry in the August sun. The rows grew longer every week. By mid-September, they covered most of the yard. Copper watched all of it with the calm interest of a dog who had learned to trust his people. He lay in the shade during the hottest part of the day and walked beside Ansel on the trips to and from the creek, and slept beside whichever of them seemed to need company more on any given night. People noticed the bricks. People in small prairie towns always noticed things that deviated from the expected. And a yard full of handmade clay bricks in Turner County in 1887 deviated considerably from the expected. A woman named Dorothea Lundgren rode by one afternoon in a wagon and stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the rows for a long time without speaking. She clicked her tongue in the way that certain people did when they had reached a conclusion. They found sad but inevitable, and that evening she told several people what she had seen and what she thought it signified. Within a week, everyone in Freeman had heard about the woman with the clay bricks, and the opinions were largely consistent. Father Cormac, the Irish priest who served the Catholic community in the county, rode out to see for himself. He was 55 years old, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his life outdoors, and the cautious eyes of a man who had learned to be careful about things he did not understand. He walked among the rows of drying bricks and looked at the shack and looked at Marta and asked what she was building. A stove, she told him. He said it did not look like any stove he had seen. She told him it was not from here. It was from Ukraine, from her grandmother. He asked where her grandmother had gotten the knowledge. She told him it came from her grandmother, and her grandmother's grandmother, that it was 300 years old. Father Cormac repeated the number slowly. 300 years. Marta told him that the cold did not care about the church. The cold only cared about physics. And physics said that clay held heat 20 times longer than iron. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slightly and rode away. The following Sunday, he mentioned from the pulpit the danger of relying on the accumulated wisdom of pagan lands, rather than trusting in proper and established methods of providing for one's family. He did not name the Krause family directly. He did not need to. The skeptics came through September and into October. A young man named Tobias Hagen came with 2 friends and looked at the structure taking shape in the center of the shack and laughed in the particular way of someone who was performing confidence rather than feeling it. He made a bet, $5, that the women would not survive until Christmas. His friends took it. A widow named Ruth Peaton stopped her horse at the fence line one October afternoon and looked at Marta working on the upper courses of the firebox. "If that thing fails in January," she said, "you will both die, and there will be no one to help you." Marta looked up from the brick she was laying. She told her they could not fail. Ruth stared at her for a long time, and then rode away without another word. Something had changed in her face before she left, some small shift in the quality of her attention. The look of someone who had started a sentence expecting to finish it one way and found themselves arriving somewhere else. The most important visitor came in the 3rd week of October. His name was Heinrich Vogel. He was 40 years old, a brickmaker by trade, German-Russian like Marta, from a village on the Volga River. He had heard about the construction project through Dorothea Lundgren's gossip, and unlike everyone else who had heard about it, he had gone very quiet when he heard it, and had ridden out that same afternoon to see for himself. He stood in front of the half-built stove for a long time, His eyes moved over the brickwork with the specific attention of someone reading a text they recognized. He asked where she had gotten the plans. She told him they came from her great-grandmother, Liesl Brandt, who had built stoves on the Ukrainian steppe. Something happened in Heinrich Vogel's face that Marta had not expected and could not immediately name. It was not skepticism, and it was not simple recognition. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been carrying a story for a long time and has just found the other half of it. He told her that his own grandfather had worked alongside a woman named Liesl Brandt on the Volga 30 years before Heinrich was born. That the channel geometry used in this particular stove designed the specific angles and proportions that determined how the heat moved through the clay mass had been developed collaboratively by her great-grandmother, and a man from his family working together over several winters refining the design until it held heat for 20 hours on a single firing. Marta stood very still while he said this, the knowledge she had been carrying across a continent. The knowledge that 300 people in Turner County had decided was the product of a strange old woman's delusion was not only real. It was the work of her family and his family together, developed over generations by people who had understood that winter was not a personal problem to be solved with personal resources, but a shared condition to be addressed with shared intelligence. He was not offering help from pity. He was offering collaboration from the recognition that this work was partly his inheritance as much as it was hers. She accepted. For the following 2 weeks, Heinrich Vogel came every day. He showed Ansel how to build a proper firing kiln to harden the bricks beyond what sun-drying alone could achieve. He showed Marta adjustments to the clay mixture refinements that had been developed in the decades since Liesl had written her notebook improvements to the thermal density of the material that would make the finished stove radiate heat more evenly through the entire floor mass. The bricks they fired in the kiln were the hardest Marta had seen since her years in Ukraine. They would last, Heinrich said, for 50 years, possibly longer. Then he went home and did not come back because the work from that point forward was hers. Ingmar Dahl came in the last week of October. He was 72 years old, Norwegian, and he had come to Dakota 30 years before and stayed because no other place had ever felt like the correct one. He was the oldest man in Turner County, and he had the particular quality of stillness that very old people sometimes develop, the stillness of someone who had long since stopped performing reactions for the benefit of observers and simply let his face show what was actually happening inside it. He stood in front of the structure, which was nearly complete now, and looked at it for a long time, with his eyes moving slowly over the proportions and the brickwork and the channel openings. Then he turned to Marta with an expression that was neither skepticism nor enthusiasm. It was recognition. He told her he had seen one of these in Bergen 50 years ago before he came to America. An old man had built it. They had called it a Russian stove. Marta felt something move in her chest that she had not felt since standing in the yard of her house in Ukraine for the last time. Someone understood. Not what the stove could do. Not the physics, not the numbers, but what it meant. What it represented, the particular kind of knowledge that survived. Not because it was written in books or taught in schools, but because someone had pressed it into the hands of a young girl on a summer morning and told her to feel for the right consistency and remember. She told him her grandmother had called it that too. She told him the Russians had learned it from the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians had learned it from people before them, and that it was 300 years of knowing how to survive a winter that was serious about what it intended. He nodded slowly. He told her it would work if she built it right. He had seen it work, but she had to build it right. She told him there was no room for error. They had no money. They had no wood. They had no coal. The stove worked or they did not survive the winter. Those were the terms. Ingmar Dow looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that she had her great-grandmother's eyes. He said he had known a woman like that once. She had never lost either. He tipped his hat and walked away. The stove was finished in early November. It stood in the center of the room, and it changed the room the way a significant thing changed the space around it, by making everything else secondary. It was white plastered and solid, taller than Marta's shoulder, built from hundreds of bricks that Heinrich Vogel's kiln had made as dense and hard as anything Marta had ever worked with. The firebox interior was lined with the hardest fired of them. The channels inside were laid out exactly as Liesel's notebook prescribed, each turn calculated to slow the heat on its way to the chimney and force it into the clay before it could escape. Marta built the first fire herself, a double handful of twisted prairie grass, the kind of fuel that cost nothing because the prairie generated it in unlimited quantities. It burned hot and fast and was gone in under 20 minutes. The room went quiet after. Ansel stood near the door. Copper lay on the floor with his head on his paws and his eyes moving between the two people he belonged to. Saoirse Callahan, who had been coming to watch and help carry bricks for the past 3 weeks, stood near the wall with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, in the way of someone who wanted something to be true and was not yet allowing themselves to believe it. Marta walked to the stove and placed her palm flat against the whitewashed surface. Warm. She pressed her hand to the floor directly beside the base of the stove, through the packed dirt, through 40 years of experience, through 300 years of women pressing their hands to floors just like this one, and feeling exactly what she was feeling now. The floor was warm. She stood up and looked at Ansel, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since Ukraine. Since Friedrich died, since her son died, since the wagon left the last place she had called home and headed west into a country that had not yet decided whether it wanted them. Not victory, not relief exactly. Something older and quieter than either. The feeling of having done the thing you were made to do with the tools you were given, and finding that the tools were adequate. The stove was not warm because of luck or hope or the goodwill of neighbors who had mostly not been willing to extend it. The stove was warm because a woman named Liesel had pressed the knowledge of how to build it into the hands of the women who came after her, one generation at a time, across a century and an ocean, until it arrived in a tar paper shack on a Dakota prairie, in the possession of a 62-year-old widow who had believed it, all of it, without reservation, because Liesel had never once been wrong. 3 days later, a bundle of twisted prairie grass appeared on the doorstep before first light. There was no note and no name. But there was only one person in Turner County who had said, "Wait for January," and had then left the very fuel that would make waiting possible without admitting in words that he had left it, because admitting it in words would have required him to admit something else that he was not yet ready to admit. Marta brought the bundle inside and set it against the wall, and said nothing about it to Ansel. Some debts were paid in ways that did not require acknowledgement, and she understood this because she had spent 62 years learning which human gestures meant what, and this one was as clear as any she had ever received. Outside, November moved into December, and December moved toward January, and the winter settled over Turner County with the serious and particular patience of a thing that had done this many times before and knew precisely how to do it. Inside, the floor stayed warm. January had been cold in the way that January in Dakota was always cold seriously, and without apology, the kind of cold that required daily negotiation and constant attention, and the particular mental adjustment that people who survive prairie winters made somewhere in November, and did not unmake until April. Marta had managed it. She had learned the stove's rhythms in the way that Liesel's notebook had promised she would learn them, not through instruction, but through daily attention, through the small adjustments of someone who was paying close enough attention to understand what she was hearing. She knew how the stove sounded when it was burning correctly. The low, steady breath of heat moving through the channels. She knew how the warmth distributed itself through the room at different hours of the day. She knew by the temperature of the floor under her bare feet, when she rose in the morning, exactly how much fuel she had used the previous evening, and how much she would need before midday. This knowledge lived in her body now, the way all real knowledge eventually did. Not in the notebook, not in the instructions, in the hands and the feet, and the specific attention of someone who had stopped thinking about the stove as a problem to be solved, and had started understanding it as a relationship to be maintained. December had passed. The first weeks of January passed. Turner County lost 2 homesteaders to the cold. In that time, both of them on isolated claims with iron stoves and inadequate wood supplies, both of them found by neighbors when the smoke from their chimneys stopped. Marta noted these losses in the way that a person noted evidence confirming a calculation they had already made. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the weather changed, not toward worse, toward better. That was the cruelest part of it. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 weeks. A wind came up from the south, gentle and damp, carrying with it the mineral smell that prairie people associated with snow beginning to melt. The smell of winter retreating, of the season offering a temporary concession. Children who had been kept indoors for most of the month were sent outside to breathe the air. Laundry that had been frozen stiff on lines came in soft and almost dry. Men walked between their barns and their houses without their heaviest coats, and told each other that the back of winter was finally broken. Marta looked out the grease paper window at 7 in the morning and felt what they all felt. Not the complete relief of a danger fully past. She was 62 years old, and she had been through enough winters in enough serious cold to know that the relief she was feeling was partial and probably temporary. But she felt it anyway, the partial relief of a morning that was not trying to kill anyone, the momentary truce that winter sometimes offered in order to make what it did next more effective. Ansel went outside after breakfast to repair a section of fence line that had come loose in the last cold snap. Copper went with him, running in circles through the softening snow with the uncomplicated joy of a dog who had spent 3 weeks mostly indoors and found the mild air a revelation. Marta stayed inside to tend the stove. She added a small amount of grass to the firebox, enough to bring the clay back to its working temperature after the overnight cooling. She had learned to do this with the economy of someone who understood that every resource had a finite end and should be treated accordingly. The stove did not need much. It never needed much. That was the point of it. The point that 200 dead people across the Great Plains had not had the opportunity to discover. She could hear Ansel outside talking to Copper in the low, easy way he talked to the dog when he was doing work that did not require his full attention. The dog's bark came back in response, cheerful and brief. Marta went to the window. It was to the west, which was where everything serious came from in Dakota, always from the west. And it was unlike anything she had seen in 5 months on the prairie, or in 62 years of living in places where winter was a matter of genuine consequence. It was not a cloud in any sense she had a framework for. It was a wall, a vertical wall of white and gray that went from the ground to the top of the visible sky, solid and opaque, moving eastward at a speed that belonged to something other than weather, something more deliberate and purposeful than weather, something that had been building since October and had finally decided it was finished waiting. She watched it for 4 seconds. Then she was through the door. She called Ansel's name. The wind had already shifted the soft southern warmth swinging around in the space of a breath to something that had nothing to do with the south, something from the northwest that hit her face like a flat object moving fast. Her voice went out into it and was pressed down toward the ground and scattered before it could travel 20 feet. Ansel was 40 yards away near the fence line. He looked up when he heard something. Not his name, probably, but the quality of the sound, the particular frequency of urgency that cut through wind when ordinary words did not. He saw the wall. He started running. Copper ran beside him with his ears flat and his body low. The posture of an animal that understood something was wrong. The wall reached them before Ansel reached the door. It did not arrive the way storms arrived in the stories Marta had been told as a child, with increasing wind and darkening sky and the gradual escalation of warning. It arrived all at once, the wall simply reaching the place where they were standing and the world they had been standing in disappearing. Snow drove horizontal, not falling but thrown as though the air itself had become a weapon. Within 30 seconds, Marta could not see the fence line. Within 60 seconds, she could not see Ansel, though he was 3 steps ahead of her. She felt him rather than saw him. His hand finding her arm in the white, and she grabbed it, and they moved together the last few feet to the door by feel alone. He got it open. They fell inside together. Copper came through behind them, and Ansel kicked the door shut, and they stood with their backs against it, in the sudden relative quiet of the shack's interior, and breathed. The stove was there. The floor was warm beneath her feet. Outside, the wind found every weakness in the tar paper walls and probed it. The sound rising and falling in the particular pattern of something that was testing, rather than simply pushing, looking for the place where the structure would give. The temperature dropped as they stood there audibly, almost the cold pressing against the walls with increasing weight. Marta went to the stove. She opened the firebox and looked at the brick interior and listened to the system the way she listened to it every morning, assessing what it had and what it needed. She added a measured amount of grass and closed the firebox and stepped back and let it work. Ansel looked at her. He said they should go out to check on the Callahan women. Their house was the nearest half a mile north. He knew Saoirse and her mother were alone there, and that their stove was iron and that their wood supply was what it was. Marta looked at him for a moment. Then she told him to go. He started to say that she should not be left alone. She told him to listen. She told him that she was the only person in Turner County who knew how to manage this stove through a 3-day blizzard in 40 below temperatures. How much fuel it needed at which intervals, how to read the sounds it made when the heat distribution was moving correctly through the channels and when it was not. If she went and he stayed, the stove would be in the hands of someone who had watched her tend it for 2 months, but had not yet developed the specific knowledge that lived in the body rather than the memory. The stove could fail. If the stove failed, everyone in this room would die. She was not being modest, and she was not being heroic. She was doing what she had done for 62 years, which was to assess a system, understand its requirements, and position the right resources at the critical points. She was the critical point. The stove needed her. The Callahan women needed him. Ansel looked at her for a long moment. He was 18 years old, and he had spent the past 6 months watching his grandmother hold everything together through the force of knowledge she carried in her hands. And he had learned in that time the difference between caution that came from love and caution that came from underestimating someone. He picked up his coat. She pressed a rope into his hand. 30 feet of it coiled the same rope she had bought at the Freeman Supply Store in November, after reading in a newspaper, found lining a shelf in the shack about a farmer in Minnesota who had died between his house and his barn during a whiteout walking in the wrong direction until he could not walk anymore. She had bought it and hung it on the nail beside the door and hoped never to need it. She tied one end to the door handle. She told him to tie the other end around his wrist and uncoil it as he moved. She told him which direction and how far, and that Seresh's house sat lower than the surrounding land, with a windbreak of 3 elms on the north side, that the elms would block the wind just enough to change the sound when he was close. He went into the white. Marta shut the door and went back to the stove. The next several hours had a particular quality that she would not be able to describe precisely when people asked her about them later. Not terror, and not calm exactly, but something between them, the focused state of someone doing work that requires everything they have and leaves no room for anything else. She fed the stove at the intervals she had determined through 2 months of daily attention. She listened to its sounds. She walked the room when she needed to move, feeling the floor temperature under her feet, checking the distribution of warmth from the center to the walls. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero by early afternoon. The wind reached velocities that made the tar paper walls flex inward visibly. The stove did not care. The clay had been doing this for 300 years, and it was not interested in the opinions of any particular winter. Ansel came back with Serisher and her mother before dark on the first day. Mrs. Callahan was white with cold, her lips moving silently with something that might have been prayer, or might have been the counting of steps. The particular counting that kept a person moving when their body had decided it was finished. Serisher was steadier, helped by the fact that she was younger and had been moving fast enough on the rope to stay warmer than her mother. They came through the door and into the warmth, and Mrs. Callahan stood in the doorway for a moment, with her eyes closed before she moved the way a person stood when they had been cold long enough. That warmth felt like something that needed to be confirmed before it could be believed. The first night passed. Marta managed the stove through it without sleeping, not because she was afraid to sleep, but because the first night of a serious blizzard was the night when the system was under the most stress, when the temperature drop was steepest and the demands on the clay were highest, and she needed to be present for it. She sat beside the stove with Liesel's notebook open on her knees and did not read it, only held it the way you held the hand of someone who was sleeping and did not need anything from you except your presence. Outside, the wind found new registers. It was no longer a sound that belonged to weather. It was something older and more personal than weather. A sound like the prairie expressing something it had been holding since the previous October and was now releasing without restraint. By midnight, the temperature was 30 below. By dawn of the second day, it had reached 40 below, with winds that the Weather Service would later calculate as creating a cold index of nearly 90 degrees below zero. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 3 minutes. Cold enough that the families who had gone to bed the previous night with iron stoves that seemed adequate had woken at 2 and 3 in the morning to rooms that were already too cold for what came next. At noon on the second day, someone knocked on the door. The knock had a specific quality, not the sharp, authoritative knock of someone who expected a welcome, but the heavy, uncertain knock of someone who had arrived at the only door available to them and was not certain they had made it in time. Marta opened it. Clarence Whitmore stood on the step, barely recognizable under the snow that had packed itself against every surface of him from his hat to his boots. His face was the color of old ash, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who had been frightened past the point where pretending otherwise served any purpose. He was a large man, and he had spent 16 years on the Dakota prairie, surviving things, and he looked like something had taken him apart. Marta stepped back from the door without speaking, and he came in and sat down on the floor near the stove without being asked. He did not remove his coat. He held his hands toward the warmth with a directness that had nothing to do with courtesy or decorum, and everything to do with the fact that his hands needed warming. And the warmth was there. She brought him hot water, snow she had melted and boiled the only thing she had that could be called a hot drink. He held the cup in both hands and looked at the stove. Then he told her about the woodpile. 12 cords of hardwood, the most he had ever laid in before a winter, stacked with care and covered with canvas against the east wall of the barn. Enough by every calculation he had ever made to last through any winter. Turner County had produced in 16 years of farming. The drifts had buried it in the first 6 hours of the storm. Not partially buried. Buried under 6 feet of compacted snow and ice that had frozen to a consistency that made it inaccessible as completely as if it had been sealed under stone. The iron stove in the kitchen had gone cold 14 hours into the blizzard. His wife Constance had burned the kitchen chairs first, then the furniture from the bedroom, then the wooden boxes and crates from the barn that Whitmore had hauled inside through the storm, then the sections of their own floor that he had pried up with a crowbar, while Constance held the lamp. Their son Ezra, who was 15 years old, had not stopped shaking since the previous night. Whitmore set the cup down. He looked at the stove. He looked at the floor. He looked at the stove again with the expression of a man doing a calculation that he did not want the results of. And then he said something that he had not said to anyone, not to Constance, not to the minister, not in 16 years of carrying it. He said that in the winter of 1881, a woman had come to their farm. She had been German or German-Russian. He was not certain which. She had come to the door in November, and she had told him she could show him how to build a stove that would not fail in a storm. She had described it the clay, the channels the thermal mass. She had used words he did not have categories for, and he had understood perhaps 1 word in 5. And he had not tried to understand more because understanding more would have required him to take seriously something that seemed to him on that November afternoon like the confused belief of an old woman who did not know how things were done in America. He had thanked her and told her they were managing fine. She had looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not forgotten. And then she had gone. 7 days later, on the 3rd night of a 3-day storm, Nell had died. Whitmore looked at Marta when he finished. She Trung looked like the woman who had come to his door in 1881. He did not mean physically necessarily. He meant something harder to describe. The same quality of knowing something with a certainty that had nothing to do with persuasion. Marta was quiet for a moment. The stove breathed its low, steady breath between them. She asked him how far his house was and in which direction. He told her she could not go out there. She told him she was not going out there right now. She told him that when the wind dropped enough to make it possible, she would go and bring his wife and son back. She told him to tell her the direction and the distance and any landmarks she should know. He told her. Then he sat back and looked at the stove that was still warm at the end of the 2nd day of the worst blizzard in living memory, and said nothing more, which was his way of saying everything he had left. At 4 in the afternoon of the 2nd day, the wind dropped from impossible to merely serious. Not safe. Not anything approaching safe. But enough that a person who knew what they were doing and had the right tools and had spent 2 months memorizing the landscape between this shack and the Whitmore place could make the attempt. Ansel stood up when he saw Marta putting on her outer coat. He told her he would go. She told him who would tend the stove. He said he would be fast. She told him the stove did not care about fast. The stove cared about the specific sequence of additions at the specific intervals she had determined. And if he missed one, or if he misjudged the quantity, the clay would cool past its working temperature, and the recovery would take hours. And in those hours, the room temperature would drop, and the people in this room, one of whom was his grandmother, and two of whom were already cold-weakened from their journey, would be in serious danger. There was no argument to be made against this. It was simply true. She went. She had the rope and the compass she had bought at the same time as the rope in the same November trip to Freeman, in the same spirit of preparation that Liesel's notebook had instilled in her over 40 years of reading. She tied the rope to the door handle as she had done before with Ansel, and she wrapped the other end twice around her wrist, and she stepped into the white. The cold at 4 in the afternoon on the second day was a different category of experience than the cold she had managed on the way to the creek in January or on the supply runs to Freeman in December. It was the cold of a system that had been accumulating its force for 2 days and had not finished. It found every gap in her clothing within the first 30 seconds, not aggressively but systematically, with the thoroughness of something that understood it had time. Her eyelashes began to freeze together after the first quarter mile. She cleared them with her fingers, a technique she had used in Ukraine winters, and kept moving. She had the landmarks in her memory. She had been paying attention to this landscape since August, looking at it the way Liesel had told her to look at things you depended on. Not for beauty or for pleasure, but for information. The slight rise in the ground 300 yards east of the shack. The line of dead cottonwood stumps along the dry creek bed that ran north to south between their claim and the Whitmore property. The way the land fell away slightly in the last 100 yards before the Whitmore farmhouse, a depression that would make the wind change sound. She walked for 45 minutes through drifts that came to her waist in places through wind that was trying without success to disorient her through a white that had eliminated every visual reference except the ground directly beneath her feet. She counted steps. She checked the compass at intervals, holding it close to her face where she could read it. She heard the wind change pitch when she was close, exactly as she had known she would. The slight drop in frequency as the farmhouse blocked it from the north. She found the door and pushed it open. The Whitmore kitchen was cold enough that her breath was visible in front of her, as though she had not come inside at all. The iron stove in the corner was cold, and had been cold for a long time, its surfaces carrying the dead look of metal from which all warmth had departed. The chairs were gone. The cabinet along the far wall had been stripped of everything burnable. Sections of the floor near the kitchen table had been pried up, the boards removed, and fed to a fire that was itself now only memory. Constance Whitmore sat against the wall below the cold stove with her knees drawn up and her hands wrapped in strips of cloth in her lap. She was 48 years old, and she was a strong woman in the specific way of women who had come to the prairie and stayed the kind of strength that was not dramatic, but was continuous and rarely mentioned, because it was simply part of what a person was. But she had the look now of someone who had reached the absolute bottom of what was available to her, and was waiting without panic, but also without much remaining hope to see what came next. Beside her, with his head on her shoulder, was Ezra. He was 15 years old, and he had his father's broad shoulders already, and his face had the gray, unsteady look of someone who had been close to something serious and was not yet entirely certain they had moved away from it. Marta crossed the room and knelt beside Constance and took her wrapped hands gently in both of her own. She told her that her husband was with her grandson. She told her to come. Ezra lifted his head. He looked at Marta with eyes that were working to focus. He asked if she was the one who had built the stove, the one everyone had said was foolish. She told him yes. He was quiet for a moment, And then he asked how she had known it would work. She thought about this question. She thought about all the ways there were to answer it. The physics of thermal mass, the 300 years of accumulated evidence, the 40 years of her own experience with her hands in clay. She told him she had not known. She had trusted. Her great-grandmother had told her it would work, and she had trusted her great-grandmother more than she trusted her own doubts. Ezra was quiet for another moment. Then he said he wanted to learn. He wanted to know how to build something that did not fail when everything else did. Something passed between them on that cold floor in the wreckage of a room that had been comprehensively dismantled in the attempt to stay warm, that neither of them could have precisely named. Something that would take years to become what it eventually became. But it started there in that specific exchange between a boy who had almost died and a woman who had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to prevent it. The walk back took nearly an hour. Ezra could move on his own, though slowly, and Marta walked beside him. Constance walked through the specific pure mechanism of will that took over when everything else had been used. Her frozen feet moving because her mind directed them to move and for no other reason. The wind increased again, halfway back the brief respite that had made the journey possible closing down as the storm found its second strength. Marta did not get lost. She had memorized the route. She had the compass. She had the knowledge of someone who had spent 62 years learning that the difference between surviving and not surviving in serious cold was almost never physical strength and almost always preparation. The kind of preparation that happened in August and September and October, when the weather was fine and the preparation seemed unnecessary. When the door of the shack appeared out of the white in front of them, Constance stopped walking. She stood in the doorway with her eyes closed while the warmth came against her face. She stood there for a full 10 seconds before she moved, which was not weakness but the reasonable response of a person receiving something they had not been certain they would receive. Ezra stepped around her and sat down on the floor beside the stove and put both hands against the whitewashed surface and held them there without moving. The night of the second day brought Father Cormac. He arrived alone on foot in the hour before midnight, wrapped in every piece of warm clothing he owned. His face was white and his lips had taken on a color that was not quite the color of healthy lips. He came through the door when Marta opened it and sat down on the warm floor without speaking, and stayed there for a long time before he said anything at all. When he did speak, he told her that he had said something in October from his pulpit about where her knowledge had come from, about the wisdom of relying on old learning from unfamiliar places. Marta waited. He told her he had been wrong. He placed his palm flat on the warm floor and held it there. He told her that God had many ways of teaching, and that he had been too proud to recognize one of them. He looked up at her and asked if she would forgive him. Marta was 62 years old. She had buried a husband and a son. She had crossed a continent and been told by every official person she encountered that she would not survive. She understood something about forgiveness that people who had not lost as much had not yet had occasion to learn. She told him there was nothing to forgive. She told him he had not known. She told him that now he did. Before midnight, Ingmar Dahl arrived. He was 72 years old and he had walked 2 miles through the storm because he wanted to know if the stove had held. He had seen one hold in Bergen 50 years ago, and he had believed this one would hold. But believing something and seeing it confirmed were different experiences. And he had decided the confirmation was worth 2 miles in a blizzard. The stove had held. He sat down on the warm floor and put his old hands against the old clay and said nothing, which was sufficient. The Callahan women had arrived before dark on the first day, But two more families came through the second night. The Wytor family from the claim to the south, whose roof had partially collapsed under the snow load, and who had walked with their youngest child, bundled against a parent's chest, through a mile of drifts. An elderly man named Ranulph, who had been alone on his claim, and had made a calculation sometime in the small hours of the second night, that he would rather attempt the walk to a warm room than remain with certainty in a cold one. 9 people in a room 12 feet wide and 14 feet long. 9 people on a floor that stayed warm through all of it, through the second night, and into the third day through temperatures that the newspapers would later describe as the worst in the recorded history of the American plains. Through wind that the Weather Service would calculate as creating conditions lethal to exposed skin in under 3 minutes. Through the complete failure of every iron stove in every farmhouse within a 5-mile radius of that tar paper shack. The stove did not fail. It had been doing this for 300 years in one form or another in clay that was not identical, but was close enough in rooms that were different in their particulars, but similar in their requirements for women and children and men who had needed exactly what it gave, which was the patient continuous release of heat that had been asked of it in a brief fire stored in hundreds of pounds of dense clay, given back slowly and without drama over the hours that followed. Marta fed it at the intervals she knew it needed. She slept for 3 hours on the second night, her back against the warm wall, copper pressed against her legs. She woke before the fire needed attention and attended to it. Outside, the storm expressed everything it had. Inside, the floor stayed warm. It had always been warm. It would stay warm for as long as someone understood how to build it and was willing to carry that understanding forward into the next season and the next generation and the next century, passing it from hand to hand, the way Liesl had passed it, not as information, but as knowledge, not as instruction, but as something pressed into the hands of someone young enough to still have all their winters ahead of them. The morning of the third day came with a quality of light that was different from the previous 2. Thinner and less aggressive, the light of a storm that had said most of what it had to say and was running out of force. The wind was still serious. The temperature was still lethal. But the wall of white that had eliminated the visible world on the afternoon of the 12th had begun imperceptibly to thin. Marta stood at the greased paper window and looked out at what remained of the storm, and felt it the way she felt the stove, not through the eyes primarily, but through some older sense, the sense of someone who had spent 62 years in relationship with weather, serious enough to kill, and had developed the specific literacy of the survived. It was almost done. She went back to the stove and added the morning fuel and listened to the system breathe. 9 people on the warm floor waited for the world outside to become a place they could return to. Thomas Mercer pressed his palm flat against the earth floor of the tar paper shack and held it there. He was a man who had spent 11 winters in Dakota Territory and who had believed with the confidence of someone whose experience had consistently confirmed his beliefs that he understood the full range of what this country could produce. He had been wrong about this, and he was standing in the evidence of his error, and he was not in any hurry to stand back up. The floor was warm, not the floor near the stove, which was the object in the center of the room that he had been trying to understand since he stepped through the door. Not just the floor within the radius of radiated heat from a fire that might still be burning somewhere inside that white plastered structure. The floor 6 feet from the stove, 8 feet, 10 feet. He had walked the room already, pressing his hand to the packed dirt at different points, the way a doctor pressed a hand to different parts of a patient, and the warmth was present throughout. Not equal everywhere, strongest nearest the stove and diminishing toward the walls, but present everywhere, consistent. Continuous the warmth of a room that had been maintained at a livable temperature through 3 days of conditions that had killed more than 200 people across the Great Plains. He stood up and looked at the woman. She was standing at the small table cutting the bread she had just finished baking, with the unhurried movements of someone doing a task she had done many times, and saw no particular reason to do differently, because visitors had arrived. She was 62 years old, and her white hair was pulled back from a face that carried the specific quality of someone who had spent the past 3 days doing necessary work, and had done it, and was now doing the next necessary thing, which was feeding 9 people who had not eaten properly since the storm began. Mercer asked how much fuel she had used. In 3 days. She set down the bread and pointed to a bundle of twisted prairie grass in the corner of the room. About a third of it remained. He looked at the bundle. He looked at the clay stove. He looked at the bundle again. Then he opened his notebook and began writing, and he wrote without looking up for a long time, recording everything he could observe and measure the dimensions of the structure, the temperature of its surface, the temperature of the floor at various distances, the quantity of fuel remaining, the number of people present, and their condition. He was not a man given to expressions of wonder, and he did not express wonder now. But he wrote with the speed and thoroughness of someone who understood that what he was looking at was important in ways that exceeded the immediate situation. One by one, the 9 people in the room began to move toward the door, toward the world outside that had resumed being a world overnight. The storm had not finished so much as it had exhausted itself, the way serious things eventually exhausted themselves. And what remained was cold but not lethal wind, but not obliterating a landscape that had been rearranged by 3 days of violence and was now settling into its new configuration. Clarence Whitmore was the last to leave after his wife and son. He stood near the door for a moment and looked at Marta. He had already said what he had to say the previous afternoon, the truth he had been carrying for 7 years, and there was nothing to add to it. But he looked at her with the specific quality of attention that people directed at things they wanted to remember accurately. The look of someone making a record. He told her he would come back. He told her he would come back, and he would bring his wife and his son, and they would learn what she had to teach. She told him to come in April, when the ground was soft enough to dig clay. He nodded and went out. The days after the blizzard were the days of counting. The official tallies would eventually place the dead at over 200 across the Great Plains, with significant losses in Turner County alone. Families who had not survived the second night. A school where children had attempted to walk home in the whiteout and had not made it. Iron stoves in farmhouses across the county that had gone cold somewhere in the first 18 hours and had not been relit. The losses were real and they were permanent, and they changed how people in Freeman and Turner County and the surrounding townships thought about winter in a way that no preceding winter had managed to change it. Because the preceding winters had been serious, but not quite serious enough, had killed some people and spared others in a pattern that allowed the survivors to believe they had done something right, rather than simply been fortunate. This winter had not allowed that belief. Garrett Whitmore came back on the morning after the storm ended. Not in April, as Marta had suggested, but the following morning, because the thing he needed to do could not wait until April. He walked into the shack and stood in front of the stove and looked at it for a long time, placing his palm against it, the way Mercer had done then, crouching down to feel the floor. Then he stood and turned to Marta and told her in a voice that was rough and unsteady. In a way, his voice was not normally rough or unsteady, that he had called her a fool, that he had looked at her clay bricks in September and laughed to himself, that he had believed with the certainty of a man who had been right about most things in 16 years of Dakota farming that he knew better than she did. He told her he had been wrong. He said they had all been wrong. He told her she had saved his wife's fingers, saved his son from something he did not want to name, directly saved him from the specific, unbearable knowledge of having been unable to protect his family a second time. He said he had nothing to give her in return except the truth. And the truth was that what she had built worked better than anything he had seen in 16 winters on the prairie. And she had built it with her hands and a dead woman's words and nothing else. He put his hand on the warm surface of the stove. He told her he would never doubt her again. He told her he would spend the rest of his life telling people what he had seen. Marta received this without ceremony. She told him to bring his wife in April, and she would show them both how to begin. The others came in the weeks that followed, each arriving with their own version of what needed to be said and their own difficulty in saying it. Father Cormac came back in the second week after the storm. Not as he had come on the second night of the blizzard, half frozen and desperate, but deliberately and in the daylight, with the specific intention of completing something he had started on the warm floor of the shack during the storm. He had said he was wrong. He wanted to say it again in conditions where he was not in immediate physical danger, so that it could not be attributed to desperation. He told her he had spoken from his pulpit about the danger of old knowledge from unfamiliar places, and he wanted her to know that he understood the depth of that error. Now, in a way, he had not understood it before. Not just that he had been factually incorrect about the stove, though he had been, but that he had used his position and his authority to make the community less willing to receive what she was offering, and that this had consequences he would have to account for in ways beyond a conversation with Marta Brandt. She told him that the knowledge had survived his skepticism, as it had survived every other form of skepticism directed at it for 300 years, and that she did not require an accounting from him, except the one he was making. He looked at the stove for a moment. Then he asked if she would accept his help in the spring in persuading the families who needed new stoves that the construction was worthwhile. She told him that would be useful. Dorothea Lundgren came in the first week of March. She stood at the door for a full minute before she knocked. Marta had seen her through the window, standing in the yard, with her hands at her sides, and her face doing the work of someone preparing to say something difficult. When Marta opened the door, Dorothea did not speak immediately. She stood on the step and looked at the floor inside the doorway, the warm, packed dirt that was the first thing visible when the door opened. Then she looked up. She told Marta she had said things about her, about Ansel, about what they were building. She said she had said them to anyone who would listen, and that they had traveled around the county and come back to her in altered forms. And she had allowed all of it because she had believed it, which was worse in some ways than saying things you did not believe. Her voice cracked on the word wrong. She had been wrong about everything. Her sister-in-law had died in the blizzard. She had been in a farmhouse 2 miles south with an iron stove and a cord and a half of hardwood, and the drift that had buried the woodpile had reached the level of the lower windowsill before the stove went cold, and by the time the snow had settled enough for anyone to reach her, she had been dead for more than a day. She had died 40 feet from a woodpile that she could not reach. Dorothea asked Marta to teach her. She asked so that no one she loved would ever die that way again. Marta stepped aside and let her in. Tobias Hagen came in late February. He was 25 years old, and he had made a bet in October that Marta would not survive until Christmas. And he had lost the bet in the most comprehensive way. A bet could be lost, which was not merely by being wrong, but by having the degree of his wrongness made permanently and publicly visible by an event that would be discussed in Turner County for the next 50 years. He did not come to apologize exactly. He came with the particular demeanor of a young man who has been reduced by events and is looking for something to replace what has been removed. He asked Heinrich Vogel if he would teach him to lay brick. Heinrich, who had continued his work in the county through the winter, taking commissions from the few families who had decided, after seeing Marta's stove in November, that they wanted one before the blizzard came, looked at Tobias for a moment and then agreed. The days after the storm had an additional dimension that Marta had not fully anticipated, which was the particular experience of watching people who had doubted her become people who did not, and of understanding that this transformation was not about her. It was about the stove. It was about the floor. It was about the specific and verifiable fact that clay held heat 20 times longer than iron, and that this fact had been true on the Ukrainian steppe and was equally true on the Dakota prairie, and would remain true long after everyone currently standing on either one of them had returned to the earth they were standing on. The knowledge did not need vindication. It had never needed vindication. It had needed someone to carry it far enough that the people who needed it could receive it. At the end of February, on a morning when the snow had consolidated into the dense, hard drifts of late winter, and the sky had the particular pale blue of cold that was still serious, but no longer lethal, Edgar Voss came. He came alone on horseback without the leather notebook he had carried on his previous visit. He tied his horse at the fence post and walked to the door and knocked in the manner of a man who was not certain of his welcome and had decided to knock anyway. Marta opened the door. He was 50 years old, and he looked it more fully than he had in August, something having been removed from his face in the intervening months that had previously provided it with its quality of comfortable assurance. He looked at her and then looked past her into the room at the stove at the floor at the stove again. He came inside when she stepped back, and he walked once around the stove in the slow, deliberate way he had walked around the shack in August, with the air of someone conducting an assessment. He tapped a brick with his finger. He looked at the floor without kneeling to touch it. Then he stood by the window and told her that the man who had held an interest in acquiring this claim, the rancher from Sioux Falls, whose inquiry had produced certain arrangements between that man and the Turner County Land Office, had died in the blizzard. He had been found on his own property 3 days after the storm, in circumstances that suggested he had left a warm building for reasons that were not entirely clear, and had not found his way back to it. With his death, certain documents relating to certain transactions were under review by the Territorial Land Office. The review was routine, Voss said. It was the kind of review that occurred when an estate needed to be settled and the records needed to be clear. He looked at Marta. If questions were raised about the specific circumstances of her claim, questions about the process by which the original parcel she had registered had been transferred, and the secondary parcel had been offered in its place, those questions would require answers that would involve a number of people, including himself, in a process that could become protracted and uncertain in its outcomes. He said this in the measured, careful language of a man who was being precise not for clarity but for protection, choosing words that said what needed to be said, without saying more than was necessary. Marta was quiet for a long time after he finished. She looked at the stove. She looked at the window. She looked at the floor. She looked at the man who had stood in her yard in August and written her death sentence in his official notebook, and smiled at her with the patient tolerance of someone who had already won. Then she told him she needed one thing. Voss reached into his coat and produced a small leather-bound register and opened it to a page and uncapped his pen. He wrote 2 words. Claim valid. He put the register away and put his hat on and walked to the door. He paused there for a moment with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the particular configuration of a man doing the arithmetic of what he had gotten wrong, and what it had cost, and what he was taking away from this room, which was not forgiveness because he had not asked for it, and not redemption because that was not available here, but something administrative and final. He went out. The door closed behind him. Marta stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she went to the stove and placed her hand against the warm, whitewashed surface and held it there. And she felt the heat the clay had been releasing for the past 2 months, steady and patient and entirely indifferent to Edgar Voss and his leather notebook, and his 2 words written in the register of the Turner County Land Office. The land was hers. It had always been hers, in every way that the word hers could mean. It was hers in law now, too. 2 words, not an apology, not an acknowledgement of anything more than a correction that needed to be made, but words that meant the land was theirs and would stay theirs, and that no further conversation on the subject was required. Marta had not needed his apology. She had needed her future. He had given her that. April came with the particular quality of Dakota Springs. Not gentle, but present. The cold retreating not by surrender, but by attrition. The ground softening day by day, until the day it was soft enough to dig. Constance Whitmore came on the first Tuesday in April, with her son Ezra, who had been asking about clay stoves since the night Marta had walked through the blizzard to find him on his mother's cold kitchen floor. They came with tools and with the willingness of people who had decided that the gap between what they knew and what they needed to know was not acceptable and intended to close it. Marta began with the clay. She took Constance to the creek bank and showed her what she was looking for, the blue-gray clay that farmers curse because it stuck to everything and drained poorly. The clay that was dense and plastic and would hold its shape when pressed and would accept the mixture of cut grass and dried prairie material that gave the finished brick its specific thermal properties. She showed her how to test it, with her hands pressing and rolling and bending the knowledge, passing through touch rather than through description. The same way Liesel's daughter had shown Liesel and Liesel had shown the women who came after her. Constance was a capable woman with strong hands and the practical intelligence of someone who had been solving complex physical problems in challenging conditions for 25 years of farm life. She learned quickly in the way that people learned who came to learning with both their hands and their attention. Ezra watched everything and asked questions that demonstrated he was not merely watching but understanding the questions of someone building a framework rather than collecting facts. Marta supervised the first 3 courses of Constance's stove and then stepped back. She answered questions and corrected errors and confirmed measurements, but she let Constance's hands do the work. Because the work needed to live in Constance's hands, not in Marta's instructions. That was how this knowledge had always moved. Not from one mind to another, but from one pair of hands to another through the specific tactile experience of making something that worked. Constance finished the stove in the 3rd week of April. Clarence Whitmore stood in the kitchen of his rebuilt home and placed his palm against the warm, whitewashed surface of the stove. His wife had built and held it there without speaking, in the way of a man for whom words had reached their limit. And what remained was the physical confirmation of something he needed to feel rather than hear. The stove worked. Dorothea Lundgren built the 2nd new stove in the county in May, with Constance Whitmore beside her, as much as with Marta. What had begun as Marta teaching Constance had already become Constance and Marta teaching Dorothea, the knowledge moving laterally, as well as forward, distributing itself through the community, the way heat distributed itself through clay, not from a single source outward, but through a network of contact and transfer, each warm point warming the next. Dorothea had been the loudest voice of skepticism in the county in August and September. She became by June the most vocal advocate for masonry stoves in Turner County. She told everyone who would listen. She brought skeptics to see finished stoves in person. She organized collective work parties for families who wanted stoves but lacked either the knowledge or the physical capacity to build alone. The woman who had spread gossip about madness was now spreading knowledge about survival. And she did it with the specific energy of someone who understood that the speed and breadth of the spreading was a form of penance that would never fully balance what she owed. Marta thought this was probably about right. By the following winter, 17 homesteads in Turner County had working masonry stoves. By the winter after that, the number had grown past the point of easy counting, because the knowledge had reached the self-sustaining state at which it no longer required Marta's direct involvement to continue. People were teaching people who taught other people, the network of hands passing what they had received to the next pair of hands that needed it. Tobias Hagen, who had bet $5 that Marta would not survive until Christmas, completed his training under Heinrich Vogel by the end of the first summer, and spent the following 3 years building stoves for families across the county, working with the thoroughness of someone who had decided that the quality of his work was the only relevant response to the size of his previous error. He never spoke publicly about the bet. He did not need to. On a morning in late May, 6 weeks after the blizzard, Constance Whitmore was sitting at the table in Marta's shack, learning to read Liesel's notebook. Her German was adequate for conversation, but not for technical language, and Marta was working through the proportions section, with her explaining the words that did not have direct English equivalents when Marta reached the end of the main body of text and turned to the inside of the back cover to show Constance the supplementary notes Liesel had added there. Marta had read this notebook for 40 years. She had read it in Ukraine on summer evenings and in winter by lamplight, and on the wagon crossing Nebraska, and in this shack on the Dakota prairie by the light of a small lamp, and by the light of the stove's brief firing. She had read every page and every margin note and every small correction written in Liesel's careful, measured hand. She had never noticed the back cover. Not the inner surface of the back cover, which was the back of the final page, and bore a small mark she had always assumed was a stain from handling. What she noticed now, turning the cover over fully for the first time in 40 years, was that the inner surface was not the back of the final page. It was the front of a page that had been carefully folded and pressed flat against the inside of the cover, and held there by the oilcloth wrapping for longer than Marta had been alive. The fold had softened over the decades into something almost imperceptible. She separated it with her thumbnail gently, the way you separated something old and fragile that had not been intended to be permanent, but had become permanent through time and circumstance. It was a letter. Small, one page, the paper thinner than the notebook pages and more yellowed. The writing was Liesel's hand, the same careful, measured script of the notebook, but smaller, more compressed, the writing of someone working in limited space with deliberate economy. It was written in German. Marta read it once, standing at the table with Constance beside her. Then she sat down. Liesel had written, "If you are reading this page, the notebook has crossed the water, and you have survived your winter. I do not know your name. I do not know what country you are in or what winter has asked of you. But I know that you are alive, because if you were not, no one would be reading this. I want you to know why I wrote the notebook. Not the instructions, those I wrote because they were necessary, but why I wrote the instructions at all, why I wrote them down rather than trusting them to memory, why I added the small corrections and the supplementary notes that accumulated over 50 years of building. I wrote them because I understood late in my life that the knowledge was not mine. I had received it from the women before me, and I had spent my life adding to it. and I was going to die as everyone died, and what I had added would die with me unless I was careful. Being careful meant writing it down. Being careful meant putting it in the hands of someone who would carry it forward. I do not know who you are. I do not know how many pairs of hands the notebook has passed through between my hands and yours. But I know what I wanted for the person who finally needed it, the way it needed to be needed, which was completely in the cold with no better option. I wanted you to be warm. And I wanted you to teach everyone around you to be warm. That is the only reason I wrote any of it. Not for one person. For everyone that person could reach. The knowledge is not yours to keep. It is yours to give. Marta sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She thought about Liesel, whom she had never met, and whose face she did not know, and who had been dead for 50 years before Marta was born, sitting somewhere on the Ukrainian steppe, with this thin page and this small, careful writing and the specific intention of reaching a person she knew she would never see. She thought about the 40 years she had spent carrying the notebook without ever finding the letter. She thought about the winters in Ukraine, and the last morning in the yard, and the wagon and Ansel, and the 8 months since August, and the 9 people on the warm floor, and the 2 words in Edgar Voss's register, and the 17 stoves in Turner County, and the women whose hands had learned what her hands had known, and were now teaching the next pair of hands. She thought about the small stone in the Freeman churchyard that marked Nell Whitmore, who had died in 1881, because a man who should have received the knowledge had refused it, and about the way that one death had sent Clarence Whitmore to their door in August, with the particular quality of attention that loss sometimes generated in people, the attention of someone who was watching for the thing they had missed the first time. She thought about Liesel on the Ukrainian steppe and Liesel's grandmother before her and all the women before that, stretching back 300 years to the first person who had understood that you did not survive serious cold. By having more than the cold, you survived it by being smarter than it, and who had pressed that understanding into the hands of someone young enough to still need it. The knowledge is not yours to keep. It is yours to give. Marta had carried it for 40 years. She had given it to Constance and to Dorothea and to Ezra and to every person who had pressed their hands to the warm floor of a stove she had built or helped build or taught someone else to build. She would keep giving it for as long as she had winters left. But for this moment she sat with Liesel's letter in her 62-year-old hands and felt the accumulated weight of everything it represented. The 300 years and the ocean crossing and the 40 years in the winter just past, and the 9 people on the floor, and the 2 words in the register, all of it pressing through the thin page into her palms. And for the first time since she had stood at her son's grave the previous spring, she wept. Not with grief exactly, not with relief exactly, with something that had no simple name, the specific emotion of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Not because the journey is over, but because the thing carried has been delivered to the place it was always going. Constance sat beside her and did not speak, because she understood in the way that women who had experienced serious loss understood the tears of other women who had experienced serious loss, that this was not a moment that required anything except presence. The stove breathed its low, steady breath between them. The years that followed had the quality of foundation rather than drama, the quality of something being built that would last longer than the people building it. Marta taught and taught and taught, not from a position of authority or exceptional wisdom, but from the practical position of someone who knew how to do a specific necessary thing and was willing to show anyone who asked. She was not a legend in her own time, or not primarily. She was a woman in Turner County who knew how to build a stove that worked, and she showed people how, and they showed other people, and the showing spread in the way that useful knowledge spread when it had been released from the person who carried it and was free to move on its own. Ansel and Saoirse Callahan were married in the summer of 1890 in the Freeman Church with Father Cormac officiating. It was a quiet ceremony and then a loud celebration in the Whitmore yard, where Constance had built a long table from lumber, and the community came with food and music, and the specific quality of celebration that followed a hard season survived the celebration of people who knew what the alternative looked like. Ezra Whitmore, who had asked Marta on a cold floor in the middle of a blizzard to teach him how to build something that did not fail, learned everything she had to teach and then went further than she had gone, studying the engineering of heat transfer through correspondence courses and eventually publishing a practical manual for masonry stove construction that was used by homesteaders across 3 territories. He dedicated it to Liesl Brandt, whom he had never met because Marta had told him who to thank, and he had understood immediately. The stove in the tar paper shack was replaced when the shack itself was replaced by a proper farmhouse, which happened in the summer of 1892, when the claim was proved up, and the land became legally and permanently theirs. But Marta had the stove moved rather than demolished, the bricks carefully numbered and dismantled and reassembled in the kitchen of the new house, because it was the first one she had built on this land, and she was not willing to reduce it to rubble. Copper died on a January morning in 1901. He was 14 years old, and he had survived the blizzard and 14 Dakota winters after it, and had watched 2 people he belonged to grow from uncertain arrivals into settled adults, with a farm and a family and a community built around something they had brought from a long way away. He died on the warm floor of the kitchen, beside the stove, with his head on his paws, and his eyes closed in the specific peaceful posture of an animal that had found a warm place and had decided correctly that there was no reason to be anywhere else. Marta sat beside him for a long time after she found him. She buried him under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard. Ansel carved the headstone himself from a piece of pale limestone. It said simply, "Copper." He understood warmth. The winter of 1910 came in with the particular seriousness of winters that intended to be taken seriously. The kind of cold that arrived in November with its full force, rather than building gradually. The kind that settled over the county like something that had decided it lived here now and was not interested in negotiating its tenancy. Marta was 85 years old. 5 years. She moved more slowly than she had moved in 1887, and with more attention to the specific geometry of her own body. The knees that had opinions about cold mornings, and the back that communicated its preferences clearly. But she moved. She tended the stove herself in the mornings, not because Ansel or Saoirse or the children could not do it, but because the stove was her relationship, and she was not yet ready to hand it to someone else. On a morning in December, Saoirse came in from outside with the notebook. It had been kept by Saoirse since the year of her marriage, because she had asked Marta if she could be the one to keep it. And Marta had said yes. And because the keeping had expanded over 20 years to include a growing body of additional notes in Saoirse's careful English handwriting observations from 20 Dakota winters, adjustments and improvements and things learned through trial and error and through the specific education of a person who had inherited a practice and made it her own. There were notes from Constance Whitmore in the margins of several pages written during the years when Constance had brought questions that needed to go back to the source. There was a short section in Ezra's more technical hand, 3 pages of engineering calculations that clarified some of the proportions Liesl had described by feel. The handwriting on the pages spanned now 4 generations and 2 languages, and the accumulated winters of more than half a century. Saoirse brought it to Marta and set it on the table in front of her. The kitchen was warm. The farmhouse that had replaced the tar paper shack 18 years ago was a proper building with proper walls and a floor that was laid over pipes that carried the warmth from the masonry stove in a slow, continuous circulation. Throughout the room, a refinement of Ezra's design that had been in use for 15 years, and that distributed the heat so evenly that every part of the floor was nearly the same temperature, warm beneath every foot, regardless of where in the room you stood. Outside, the December cold pressed against the windows in the way of something that had been doing this for a very long time and expected to go on doing it. Snow was beginning small, precise flakes that settled without drifting. The kind that meant more serious cold was close behind. Their granddaughter was 8 years old, and she was in the corner of the kitchen with her hands in a bucket of clay mixed with cut prairie grass, learning the consistency by feel, turning it and pressing it and bending it the way Marta had learned to turn and press and bend clay on a summer morning in Ukraine when she was 11 years old, and her grandmother's hands had guided hers toward the right consistency without describing it, the knowledge passing through contact rather than through words. Marta watched her. She had the attention of a child who was genuinely learning, not performing learning for the benefit of an observer. She had her hands in the clay, and her eyes were on her hands, and she was doing the thing that all real learning required, which was being present to the sensation of the material telling you what it was. Saoirse sat down across from Marta. She told her the girl had been asking all week about the notebook, about where it came from and who had written in it, and why the letters in the front part were in a different language than the letters in the back. Marta looked at the notebook on the table. The cracked leather cover, soft now beyond cracking, had taken on the particular texture of something that had been handled with care for a very long time. The texture of an object that had been touched by many hands and had absorbed something of the quality of those hands into itself. The oilcloth that had protected it across an ocean and a continent and 60 years of seasons was worn thin but still present, still doing its work. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was clear as it had been the first time she had read it 50 years ago, on a summer evening in Ukraine, with her grandmother beside her. The measurements and the proportions and the channel specifications and the small, careful instructions for a woman who needed to know how to build something that would keep her warm when the cold came. She told her granddaughter to come. The girl came with clay on her hands and sat down beside her and looked at the notebook with the attention of someone encountering something they recognized as significant before they fully understood why. Marta told her that her great-great-grandmother had written this notebook on the Ukrainian steppe more than 100 years ago. She told her that the stove warming this floor had been built from what this notebook contained. She told her that the warmth coming through the floor under their feet right now was the warmth that the notebook had made possible, carried forward through the hands of every woman who had learned from it since Liesl had put the last word on the last page and hidden the letter in the back cover for someone she would never meet. She turned to the place where the letter had been and smoothed the page flat with her palm. The girl asked if she could learn to read it. Marta told her yes. She told her it was not a test. She told her it was an invitation. The stove breathed its slow, steady breath in the warm kitchen. Outside, the December snow was falling more seriously now. The flakes larger, the sky lower. The prairie settling into the posture of a season that had arrived and intended to stay. The cold that was coming would be the kind of cold that this territory knew how to produce, the kind that required knowledge and preparation, and the specific intelligence of people who understood that surviving a serious winter was not a matter of individual strength, but of what had been passed from hand to hand across the years through the specific contact of teaching and learning and teaching again. Marta placed her hand on the warm surface of the notebook cover and felt the accumulated handling of a century, the warmth of every hand that had held this before her, and every hand that would hold it after. The floor was warm. It had always been warm since the first brick was laid in the August heat, and the clay dried in rows in the Dakota sun, and a woman who had been told she would not survive the winter had pressed her hands into the earth and found exactly what she was looking for. It would stay warm for as long as someone remembered how to build it and was willing to carry that knowledge forward into the next season and the next pair of hands that needed it, passing it not as information, but as something that lived in the body, pressed from hand to hand across whatever distance and time, and the law stood between the giver and the receiver. That was the legacy. Not the stove, not the notebook, not 2 words in a land agent's register, or a headstone in the Freeman churchyard, or a manual used across 3 territories. The legacy was the knowledge itself, moving forward through the hands that held it, unstoppable and undiminished warmer for being given than it had ever been for being kept. The floor is warm. It has always been warm. And it will stay warm for as long as we remember how it was made.